Hi everyone, welcome back to the Odditorium. For today's video, in essence, we're looking at an extremely gruesome story, one that I've heard some people say is one of the worst stories, if not the worst story, of child brutality that they have ever heard. With that said, just a polite reminder to please exercise viewer discretion when deciding if to proceed. The following discussion can and will get pretty graphic and disturbing at times, so consider yourself warned. It's April 28th, 2009, in Bakersfield, California. Ramon Rodriguez is one of the first to encounter Angelo Vidal Mendoza just moments after an absolutely heinous attack has taken place over at Angelo's place only a few blocks away. At this time, Ramon is unaware of anything that has happened. When he looks up, he's a bit startled to see a man barreling in his direction in a wheelchair. It's something about the way the man is that makes Ramon feel as if something isn't quite right about this stranger. And just to get it out of the way, this man, whom we've already established as Angelo Mendoza Sr., is 34 at the time, and he's been wheelchair-bound as the result of being stabbed in the back during a robbery in 2004. He's been paralyzed from the waist down ever since this nasty incident approximately 4 years ago, but we'll touch more on this subject as we progress. Right now, as this wild wheelchair wanderer quickly moves in closer and closer, one of Ramon's first thoughts is that something about him just looks crazy. He's real bug-eyed. Ramon also concludes that, judging by his looks, demeanor, everything, the fast-approaching man definitely had to be on something. As you're about to see, things only get progressively more strange, or as Ramon puts it, pretty bizarre, as the encounter between these two men unfolds. Having by now wheeled himself all the way here to a front yard on East Terrace Way, and away from what is still unbeknownst to Ramon a crime scene back at Angelo's apartment on Ohio Drive, Angelo now proceeds to ask Ramon rather randomly if he can play with him and his pet dog. Eyeballing the man strangely, Ramon denies Angelo's request, and this seems to invoke in Angelo an unusual response. At once, Angelo scoots himself off his chair and, using presumably only his arms, he drags himself off into the backyard of an adjacent vacant apartment. Dressed originally in just boxers and a sweater, somewhere along the way, Angelo also manages to lose all of his clothes. Now, once in that vacant backyard, still stripped down naked, he chains himself to a tree. Ramon pretty easily catches up with the twitchy, wild-eyed man, but when he turns that corner, he's at a complete loss for words at what he sees. Not only is Angelo just sitting there on the ground naked and clumsily chained to this pole or this tree, but he's also apparently managed to, at some point along the way, locate an axe, which he now sits and holds tightly in his grip. Upon spotting Ramon, Angelo tells him to look at the sun and pray with him, and before Ramon even has a second to think of how to react, Angelo takes the axe and begins trying to hack away at one of his own legs, all while he's just yelling incoherently. Ramon later admits when interviewed that he feels kind of scared for a minute, but it's not enough to stop him from pouncing on top of Angelo and attempting to wrestle the axe away. In probably realizing that Angelo isn't exactly in his right state of mind right now, Ramon's motivation is that of a good Samaritan. He's merely trying to help Angelo save him from his own self. And so a brief struggle ensues. At one point, when Ramon tries to take the axe away from him, Angelo tries to bite Ramon's hands. This is when Ramon notices the dried blood that's become caked around Angelo's mouth. Ramon later recalls wondering for a fleeting moment if that's this man's own blood or what. It's a passing thought, though, as Ramon at last succeeds in wrangling the would-be weapon from this crazed, crippled man who now sits, at least for the moment, defeated. Continuing the role of Samaritan, Ramon doesn't hesitate next to go find the nearest phone from which he's finally able to dial the police. And yet, this isn't going to be the first call that the local Riverside dispatchers receive this evening, summoning them over to this same neighborhood. Little does Ramon still have yet to uncover, but the real horror show actually started earlier that evening down the road at a humble and totally unsuspecting dwelling on Ohio Drive. In short time, Ramon's going to find out a truth so dark and twisted, it's enough to make any grown man absolutely sick to his stomach. It's a truth that's also going to make him assert that if he had known of it at the time, he swears that he, quote-unquote, would have just let him cut his leg off. Of course, this has to make us wonder, what could this totally helpless individual, this pathetic, nude, and incoherent, strange, bumbling man possibly ever have done to make a guy like Ramon regret stopping him from severely damaging himself with that rusty old axe? Well, for those of you who haven't yet heard this story, brace yourself. many might come to agree that it's hardly an exaggerated reaction on Ramon's part. Except before we get to talking about what brought us here to this abandoned backyard, to Ramon calling 911 on a naked paraplegic who's conversing with the sun in gibberish, I think we first need to rewind all the way back to the year 2006 in hopes that some context might help us shed some light on the crazy events of today. It's on one day in 2006, about 3 years prior, that police arrive at the home of Angelo Mendoza Sr., only to discover that he and Desiree Marie Bermudez, the biological mother of their then infant son Angelo Jr., are both under the influence of PCP, while they of course have Angelo Jr. in their care. To make matters worse, a sweep of the residence uncovers residue of this heavily hallucinogenic substance stashed away inside a pill bottle that's wrapped up together with their baby boy inside his very own crib. Upon the discovery of the drug residue in the crib, coupled with the discovery of the parents both high, Mom and Dad are promptly taken into custody, later to be charged with being under the influence of PCP, as well as with child endangerment. Meanwhile, Child Protective Services, or CPS, takes Angelo Jr. temporarily into their custody. Both parents plead no contest to the charges, and the defendants each are sentenced to just a few years probation and a couple of court-ordered classes at very most. Except as simple as these requirements sound to me, particularly when you consider what's at stake to lose, Mom, Desiree, ends up failing her court-ordered drug classes. That in turn ends up resulting in a warrant for her arrest, which come April of 2009, later on, is still outstanding, and this will be relevant to us in just a little while. As for Angelo Sr., however, he really ends up exceeding everyone's expectations. He not only just breezes through his court-ordered year-long parenting class, but he also ends up the recipient of an award for excellent parent participation courtesy of a Head Start school. And in the end, it readily appears all of this hard work really pays off. That namely turns out the case when CPS determines Angelo rehabilitated, and despite the prior existence of a lengthy prison record that is over 20 criminal charges and counting, he is awarded full custody of the baby boy he previously stashed right alongside his PCP not too long ago. And for any skeptics out there, 3 years later, come the start of 2009, Angelo Sr. has yet to drop the ball. In fact, it's again rather the opposite. Just to paint a quick picture of how things are, at this point Desiree is 23 years old, Angelo Sr. is 34, and Angelo Jr. is now just 4 years old. Angelo Jr. lives full-time with his father at an apartment complex on Ohio Drive, and it's presumed that Desiree, who lives apart, still visits with Angelo Jr. on a regular basis. Even as we inch closer and closer to April 28, 2009, the day of what we'll just refer to as the incident for now, it's still hard for anyone to imagine the horror that's about to take place. Because at a glance, and for quite a long time, everything seems in good shape over at the apartment. As we just touched on, by all appearances, Angelo Sr. is really pulling it off this time around. Most people who know him would even probably describe him as practically the perfect model father. Not only has Angelo sworn off drugs, he's also branched out and made new friends with healthier interests. One of his new friends, Artie Gray, is also wheelchair-bound as the result of being the victim of a crime. Later, Artie tells reporters that the two of them had been planning and rigorously training for a cross-country trip in their wheelchairs, with their goal being to raise awareness for victims of brutal crimes. And among other things, Angelo also now plays wheelchair basketball, and he has also enrolled in classes at Bakersfield College. But undoubtedly, best of all, it seems that Angelo continues to take good care of his young boy as well. Tanya Hammond, who has an apartment next door to Angelo's, attests to the fact that prior to just shortly before the incident, she believed Angelo to be the epitome of the doting father. She'll go on to later state in an interview that, quote, the boy was his life, end quote, and she recalls how, quote unquote, the boy was always running after daddy. Jesse Rosas, Angelo Sr.'s brother, echoes very similar sentiments. In his own words, the uncle states that, quote, when Angelo Jr. and his dad were together, the love they had for each other was outrageous. He loved his son, and he did whatever he could to help his son out, end quote. Up until just weeks leading up to the incident, this is very much the consensus that Angelo Sr. is just this all-around amazing father who wouldn't hurt his son in a million years. And so for a moment there, all seems to be going even better than ever expected for the single father in little Angelo Jr., except for one tiny little problem. We can't know for sure whether he fibbed and never actually totally got off the drugs to begin with, or else whether he more recently fell off the wagon. But according to some people's reports, for the last week or two, maybe longer, Angelo hasn't been acting quite his usual self. It's in fact not one, but several witnesses who see Angelo in the weeks leading up to the April 28th incident that have a very different song to sing. One man Angelo has gotten to know from wheelchair basketball is Harvey Clowers. Following the incident, Harvey tells reporters how, in weeks leading up to that fateful day, he noticed a change in Angelo. Quote, "It just seems like he had a wild look in his eyes. He was kind of speeding around, rolling fast, and just moving around like he was under the influence of something," end quote. Others similarly report having seen the same crazed look cloud Angelo's eyes in recent times. Even the next-door neighbor, Tanya, who previously gushed over Angelo's parenting skills, admits that in weeks leading up to the April 20th incident, she felt like there was just something strange about Angelo. She too spoke with KBAK, revealing that it's just like that week he started acting different, quote-unquote. More specifically, she states that he had grown noticeably more short-tempered, but she insists that these behavioral changes were only as of recent times, maybe a few weeks leading up to the 28th at best. Before then, as seems to be the general consensus, nothing was ever out of the ordinary over at the Angelos. If there's one thing we already know for certain, it's that in a matter of mere minutes, on this day, countless lives are about to be changed forever. And for one small boy in particular, for no good reason, nothing is ever going to be the same again. Presumably the day begins routinely enough, but it isn't long before things escalate. Tanya recalls how on that day, she's outside doing some yard work when she sees Angelo Jr.'s mother pull up for visit, so it appears. Desiree herself later explains to KBAK that she's there to deliver a pizza. Whether or not that's what she's truly there to deliver, that's at least what she claims. So what should be a fairly simple thing for an average person to do, that is drop off a pizza, perhaps have a bite, maybe make a bit of small talk, and then leave amiably, doesn't work out that way for this former couple. Because at some point during this mother's visit is that the police get called to Angelo's residence, and the person making that call might be surprising. It is actually Angelo Sr. himself who calls the cops on Desiree. And very little about this call is actually known, but we know the gist of it is along the lines of Angelo Sr. calls to request assistance from the police because he asserts Desiree is causing a disturbance at his home. Of course, not surprisingly, if you listen to the other side of the story, Desiree's side, things are going to sound a little bit different.
Desiree tells us she actually visited the apartment that fateful night.
I was bringing the pizza in, and then he started just yelling at me. My son was just crying, "Mommy, Mommy, I want to go with you. I'm scared." And I was just like, should I take him or should I just, leave him?
But because Angel had full custody and she thought her son was safe, Desiree left.
So, according to the boy's mom, Angelo starts yelling at her out of the blue and for no apparent reason. As Desiree tells reporters, he yells at her to leave and then threatens to call 911. Desiree insists that this all came about unprovoked, but regardless, the most tragic part of this part of the story is that as Desiree looks as though she's about to leave, Angelo Jr. comes running up to her crying and just acting very afraid. He's not hiding the fact that he's afraid of being left alone with his own dad when, at this point, he grabs onto his mom and begs her not to leave him behind. Desiree recalls the following, quote, "My son was crying, 'Mommy, Mommy, I want to go with you,' end quote. The young boy would then add the following two foreshadowing, albeit simple words, 'I am scared.' Desiree admits giving it only a moment's thought before she states, 'I pushed him back inside the door,' adding that simply, 'It was kind of hard.' After the incident, Desiree informs a local news outlet that the reason she seemed not to think too much about leaving her frightened, crying 4-year-old child behind to remain alone with a man who, to her, should have evidently seemed not right in his mind. I mean, if indeed he actually just had flown into a rage at her over nothing. She explains she didn't think much about leaving the boy because, for one, Angelo had never been violent with her or her child before. And for another, she didn't think Angelo would ever in a million years be capable of hurting his own son. Well, the problem with that logic on this day in particular is that Angelo, that is the actual Angelo who is incapable of hurting his own son, isn't there at this time. It's not Angelo that's standing before her on that day and in that moment. Of all people, she should have been able to recognize the signs of PCP intoxication in her ex, with whom she actually has a history of using the drug together with. And finally, just one more seriously glaring problem I have with Desiree's decision to leave Angelo Jr. behind on that day is more or less just the knowledge that, personally, I wouldn't care how much I thought I trusted anyone. If my child is coming up to me saying, "Mommy, Mommy, please don't leave me here, I'm scared," if my child is crying and begging me to get them away from a person or a situation, then by virtue of that, right there alone, I'm gonna know that something's wrong. But I guess ultimately the bottom line is that in the end, Desiree pushes her son back inside and then she leaves. And as it turns out, and as we already know, Angelo Sr. hasn't only just threatened to call the police, he's actually done it. Desiree may or may not have known that he did this, but now in light of this new predicament, it's only normal to wonder if perhaps the reason the mother got out of there as fast as she did doesn't have something to do with that pesky, outstanding warrant of hers. In other words, since she's got this warrant for her arrest, the last thing she probably wants is to have any run-ins with the cops, and so her fear of them finding her there might be at least partially why she books it out of there so quickly at the threat of the cops being called. And not to mention, worst of all, her hasty decision to leave behind her frightened, crying son. Now, with that said, there's still another account that I think it might be of interest to mention. And perhaps not surprisingly, some of the details of what happened differ among these two versions as well. If you recall, we've already been introduced to Tanya Hammond, the next door neighbor who says she's tending to the yard when Desiree and a friend stop by for an apparent visit of sorts. Tanya, of course, isn't privy to what transpires inside the home, that is, assuming that Desiree even goes into the apartment that day, but Tanya does see Desiree leave, and the bit of drama she observes is what first raises her concern as to the commotion that might be stirring up next door. It's upon Desiree's attempt to leave the residence that Tanya sees little Angelo running up to his mom. According to Tanya, quote, Angel, as she calls the little boy, wanted to go home with her, end quote. She continues to state that, quote unquote, he kept saying, Mama, I want to go home, and that he specifically said to her, I am scared of Daddy. As Tanya later tells an East Bakersfield reporter, ABC 23's Christine Din, when Desiree pulls up that day, she recounts that the mother appears to have arrived there along with a friend, seeing the mother look over at her friend and say, quote, we have to go. Angelo, the father, is flipping out and I don't know what he's tripping on, end quote. But she concludes, quote unquote, he's starting to call the cops, we have to go. And it was on that note that Angelo Jr. was rather selfishly left behind by Desiree and her companion. Tanya's version of events, although small, is significant, because if true, and I don't see any reason to doubt this neighbor's testimony at all, it works to change quite a bit in light of Desiree's culpability. While it doesn't make Desiree an accomplice to what happens to little Angelo after she leaves, it does make her responsible for not taking the proper actions when faced with a reasonable suspicion that the child might be in some kind of danger. It's true that nobody who knew the elder Angelo that was interviewed suspected he would ever turn on his own son, but these are special circumstances which change everything. It's only a mother's duty, and I'm surprised it wasn't also her instinct to do what she can to at least try and ensure her child's safety regardless of her warrant or her fear of the cops or of anything. But at the end of the day, the basic fact remains that this so-called mother does flee before the cops arrive, and she does leave Angelo Jr. behind with his dad, whom she knows firsthand is acting totally unstable. It's no valid excuse in my book, but perhaps she thinks, oh, he's acting a little weird, but he's never hurt anyone in all the previous times he's been high, so there's nothing to really worry about. Except the woman who failed her own court-ordered drug class of all people should have known that not all trips are created equal, and that especially with a dissociative anesthetic that doubles as a pretty intense hallucinogen, by leaving Angelo Jr. behind on that afternoon, she should have known that she was taking a pretty significant gamble with regard to little Angelo's safety. I think ultimately what it comes down to is the sad fact that possessing a common sense isn't a prerequisite for bringing life into this world. At any rate, it's said that the cops do arrive and speak with Angelo Sr., and of course by now Desiree appears long gone, and the cops, astonishingly enough, it's said that they even put in their notes that at the time they observed nothing out of the ordinary at the Mendoza home. This is at roughly only about an hour and a half before the unthinkable is about to occur, and yet somehow Angelo Sr. is apparently able to keep it all together for them. But it is what it is, unfortunately. I assume that after a quick discussion with Dad, the police officers turn around and they leave. And once again, Angelo closes the front door, probably also locking it behind them. And once again, it's Angelo, the delusional dad, plagued by wild hallucinations, with Angelo Jr., the frightened and helpless 4-year-old child, inside the apartment, together all alone. From this point on, from the moment that the front door shuts behind the two of them, we of course don't have a play-by-play of every last detail, but luckily the relevant facts have been pieced together more or less. What we know about next is that at some point Angelo decides to just out of the blue attack his young son, 4-year-old Angelo Jr. Well, it probably seems to come out of left field for any of us observers, but inside Angelo's mind, it's undoubtedly a response to some bizarre delusion that has just entered his brain. Meanwhile, from outside, Tanya recalls she begins to hear yelling coming from inside Angelo's apartment. It's reported she hears Angelo screaming incoherently, and that it's not too long after that she observes Angelo coming out of his apartment. He appears nervous as he quickly flees the premises in his wheelchair, and with the younger Angelo nowhere in sight. Tanya is naturally alarmed at what she's just heard and seen. It's said that, accompanied by another individual who may in fact be a minor child themselves, Tanya heads over to the apartment to check up on Angelo Jr. Driven by her strong sense that something is terribly wrong, once Angelo Sr. has wheeled himself down the street and out of sight, she makes her move and enters the apartment. As she does so, she's calling out for the young boy, whom she's always referred to as Baby Angel, but she's only met with silence. At this point, even if perhaps she knew intellectually what might be coming, my bets are that still nothing could have prepared her for what she actually came across when she inched cautiously farther into the home. To Tanya's absolute horror, there's Angelo Jr. lying, as she later described it, in a pile on the floor. He's mostly unclothed and seems to be unconscious. She can also see obvious bite marks on his hands. Not wanting to get too close so as not to disrupt anything, Tanya states that from where she stands, she can also readily see that the little boy's eyes appear to be swollen shut, and that he's bleeding from out his eyes as well. Or, she tells one reporter in her own words, quote, "You could see skin or something coming down and you could see blood," end quote. Tanya states that she continues calling out to the boy, but that he remains unresponsive. So she immediately dials 911 and relays all of this and other pertinent information to the dispatcher. The one hope she has is that, in spite of his condition, she can see his chest faintly rising up and down, an obvious indicator that the boy is still breathing and hence obviously still alive. Except without knowing what really happened and the little boy remaining unresponsive, it's anybody's guess as to how long he'll be able to keep hanging on. Dispatchers accordingly route emergency personnel quickly to the scene, and as the police get called back to Angelo's apartment for the second time in under 2 hours, Tanya does her best to remain calm while remaining on the line with 911 until first responders arrive. But for now, upon arrival to 322 Ohio Drive, Tanya points police in the direction of where she came across the little boy. And as Tanya had previously described, Angelo Jr. is found more or less in the same way, on the floor, bloody, only partially clothed, and very obviously injured, with his eyes apparently swollen shut. Once police arrive, the boy starts to stir, but he's twitching and he's shaking violently. Yet still, good news is that slowly but surely the boy is regaining consciousness. Much to everyone's relief, he's alive, but he is far from being anything resembling in good shape. In addition to the fact that he's shaking rather violently, police can also readily see that the boy's pants and underwear, which are soaked in his own urine, have been pulled down and off of him. He's got bite marks on his face, and his hands are riddled with bite marks as well. Once his awareness returns, the 4-year-old explains to the police that what happened is rather simple. He tells them in one heartbreaking sentence, "Daddy bit my eyes and hands." Surely enough, Angelo's eyes are probably in the worst shape of all, but with so much swelling, it's hard for anyone to assess the true damage just yet. Suffice it to say, Angelo Jr. is transported quickly to a Fresno hospital, where the boy repeats the same explanation to a hospital volunteer. Using 5 similarly heart-wrenching words, Angelo Jr. repeats to them the problem. That is, quote-unquote, "My daddy ate my eyes." It takes time, but after the swelling goes down a bit, the doctors are able to better see what they're working with. As they'll come to discover, Angelo Jr.'s left eye and muscle are completely missing, having been eaten right out of his face by his very own, once believed, doting father. And at first, dozens of reports come out stating that his right eye, too, is damaged beyond repair. In the end, though, while indeed severely mutilated, Angelo Jr. surprises everyone by making a recovery that is considered nothing short of miraculous. Although left without a left eye and permanently blind in most of his right eye as well, he does in the end manage to retain partial vision in that one remaining eye, which is more than what initially anyone seeing Angelo Jr.'s state could have ever hoped for. But going back now to the scene of the crime and vicinity, it isn't too long before the cops locate Angelo Sr., still chained to that tree in the abandoned yard and hacking at his legs with now not the axe that Ramon had forcibly wrangled away, but now instead with a piece of a broken ceramic plate he's located somewhere nearby. When they begin questioning Angelo, Angelo tries to convince authorities that gang members did this. He tells them that his son is injured back at home, and he continues to repeat that all of this has been the work of Mexican mobsters. The police are naturally incredulous of what Angelo is telling them, and they suspect PCP intoxication pretty much immediately, which is noted in their subsequent report. Angelo Sr. is eventually inevitably arrested, but first he's sent to the Kern Medical Center where he's allowed to recover from the self-inflicted injuries to his own legs. As time goes on, more grisly details about what happened to Angelo Jr. once it was just the two of them, dad and son, inside that apartment, continue to emerge. Responding to internal stimuli, that is a delusion or hallucination of some sort that only Angelo himself could see or hear, something he could alone perceive, he commences a seemingly random attack on his little boy. As the elder Angelo grabs onto his boy, holding him in place, Dad then bites directly into Angelo Jr.'s eyes. Using just his own mouth and teeth, the father rips out the 4-year-old's left eye entirely and then begins work on the boy's right eye as well. I was unable to find a single article or report that attested that Angelo Jr.'s left eye was ever recovered anywhere. This does point strongly to the notion that Dad did rather literally, in fact, eat his son's eye. During the attack, the father also removes the child's clothing, although we're uncertain as to why, and we also can't say with certainty whether this came before or after the decision to bite into his son's eyes. Due to the placement of evidence at the scene of the crime, investigators conclude that in an attempt to break free from his attacker, Angelo Jr. struggles to pull a heavy dresser in between him and his assailant, after which the boy cowers behind it and eventually, probably as per the result of too much trauma at once, both mental and physical, the little boy passes out. It's presumed that less than minutes after this, the father flees the home and wheels himself several blocks away where he'd finally come to encounter Ramon. Everything from Angel's prior history to his particular behaviors and to numerous peculiar symptoms now, to even the fact that so many people claimed how in his natural state Angelo Sr. did not have a violent bone in his body, go toward corroborating a theory that the man was without a doubt under the influence of his drug of choice yet again. Only this time, getting off might prove to require a little bit more than attending a weekly meeting. Or would it? This time, it'll be in May of 2009 that Angelo is officially charged with mayhem, torture, child cruelty, and inflicting injury to a child. Even though, on that first day, that is, the day of his arrest, Angelo seems to stick firmly to the story about the culprits having been members of the Mexican Mafia, by the next day he changes his tune a bit. During another round of questioning the next day, this time he tells police that he was out of his mind at the time. He also adds the request that they please tell his son that, quote-unquote, I love him, and, quote, let him know that his dad was off his medication, end quote. As much as I would really love to get into the many reasons why this defense, i.e. what caused his hallucinations, his behavior, all of it, was the direct result of him being off his prescription meds, is absurd and practically impossible, it is regrettably beyond the scope of our discussion. At the same time, I can't bring myself to leave it completely untouched. Keep in mind that Angelo's prescription meds, the ones he was supposedly not on, an act that turned him into a deranged cannibal, were meds that were prescribed to control seizures and paralysis issues. They were not, as it might be implied or assumed, antipsychotic medications or psychiatric medications of any kind. Also, note that by Angelo Sr.'s own almost eager admission, he had informed authorities that for the past several weeks leading up to that late April attack, he'd been feeling nervous and hallucinating. Think about that for a second. By virtue of him informing the police about his hallucinatory state, it was something he evidently had the presence of mind to recognize while off his meds. And yet, at the same time, he claims via his actions it is something that for some inexplicably jacked up reason, he still doesn't find compelling enough of a reason to just wheel himself over to the medicine cabinet and simply resume taking that very medication which is causing him this purportedly unpleasant and distressing and dangerous state of mind. The logic doesn't work out, rendering the whole excuse, explanation, or what have you invalid. Let me just state that one of Angelo's prescriptions for dealing with his paralysis was for medical marijuana, which he had nonetheless sworn off of a good while back. That said, let's just say if Angelo is claiming that pot withdrawal had made him experience psychosis, this too would be a theory that's kind of difficult to accept.
Hey!
What do you want?
Bring me some reefers. Faster! Way faster! 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 You want to kill me? You're crazy.
It's seriously unlikely. But if by chance it's true that pot withdrawals are compelling you to go take a bite out of your son's face, then I don't care what excuse you're going to have to give at your next NA meeting, 1 or 2 hits of your prescription weed isn't going to kill you. It's said that the prescription weed was found in his medicine cabinet. Well, if you're convinced it's making you crazy by not taking it, go take it, is what I'm saying. But as we hopefully can all see, something isn't right about this excuse. Weed or withdrawal isn't the culprit here, and I'm far from alone in my opinion.
Police officers believed the 34-year-old man to be under the influence of the drug PCP.
It's real addictive.
This woman is a recovering PCP or angel dust addict who does not know the defendant but says his behavior is consistent with what effect the drug has. The drug rehabilitation center she attends told us that the drug is increasingly popular in the east side of Bakersfield because it's so cheap. That's the part of town where Mendoza and his son lived.
Moving along, however, when it would come time for Angelo to appear in court, it's rather astonishing, but he would at first actually be deemed incompetent to stand trial. This, by the way, was said to be due specifically to quote-unquote medication issues. So from that point, Angelo would be shipped off to Patton State Hospital, where medical professionals had 3 years to restore Angelo to competency. Angelo remained there for over a year until he was deemed to be restored to competency, and during a hearing in October of 2010, it said that he entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. In response, Kern County Superior Court Judge Gerald Tutner appointed 2 psychologists to independently evaluate Angelo Sr. and determine his level of sanity on the date of the horrible crime. Not much else was or has ever been said about the details regarding this case due to a gag order that was put in place relatively early on. Nonetheless, we know that on February 10th, 2011, Angelo would return to court, this time pleading guilty on all 4 counts he'd been charged with. And yet, in a totally insane and unfathomable twist of events, Superior Court Judge Michael G. Bush entered a final ruling of not guilty by reason of insanity. This despite Angelo's own guilty plea and in spite of all the common sense evidence that points to the father's absolute and unfaltering guilt. Judge Bush's reasons stem from the reports handed down by the mental health professionals that had been appointed to evaluate the defendant in months prior. In the end, I feel confident that I speak for a lot of other people as well when I say that I'm left just stunned at this decision. It's truly unbelievable considering that the dude was so obviously under the influence, this is my opinion, not to mention his history of drug abuse and other pretty rampant criminal activity. But in the end, again, in spite of his own guilty pleas, the judge buys some hack's so-called professional opinion, and ultimately Angelo Sr. is ruled to be not guilty by reason of insanity. It's incomprehensible. And I believed that in most states, when someone is acting due to being under the influence of some illicit substance, they cannot plead insanity. There's a difference between someone who's messed up and someone who's quote-unquote insane. And from all that I've researched about this case, it is my strong personal opinion that Angelo Sr. did what he did as the result of the effects of being intoxicated and not because he has some underlying mental condition that just conveniently decided to pop up randomly in his mid-30s. Furthermore, let's just say that was actually the case. Angelo's actions on that fateful day of the 28th aren't in line with somebody experiencing a psychotic break, but rather they fit the behaviors of many a PCP-induced psychosis down to the letter. Everything from the violent attack on his son's eyes in particular, all the way to the stripping off of his clothes. But the only thing I'm even going to say about this any further is with regard to what happens next. I've scoured all ends of the earth, and for me, Angelo's current whereabouts remain unknown. We don't know if he's out or if he's still in a hospital or what. But going by what was last written about this case that I could find, Angelo's not guilty sentence essentially meant Angelo being placed at Metropolitan State Hospital in Norwalk. As Bakersfield.com would quote prosecutor Melissa Allen, generally the only way a person can be released from a state hospital is if they're found to be restored to sanity. And if that should happen, then, quote, the person would be sent to a halfway house for outpatient treatment, end quote. Finally, we're informed that to be completely released, there would need to be a determination that the person is no longer insane and also no longer a danger to himself or others. I don't know about anyone else, but these are hardly reassuring statements. It doesn't seem that it would really take much more than a chain of events occurring a certain way at a certain time for Angelo Mendoza Sr. to find himself a free man once again. While Angelo's own attorney has predicted that in the end Angelo Sr. will likely live the rest of his life out in a psych ward, others didn't seem as convinced. It may end up ultimately the decision of a random caseworker whether they believe Angelo is rehabilitated enough to function among society or not, and just recalling the way he's always been able to charm and impress people with his hard work and perseverance in the past. Well, ultimately, it doesn't personally sit well with me, to put it mildly. If the prevailing theory is true, that Angelo was only momentarily psychotic due to being under the influence of drugs, then it shouldn't be too hard for him to appear rehabilitated once he's gone a certain length of time no longer on any drugs. It's scary, but I can all too easily see a lesser qualified guy or girl, be it a social worker or an MD, mistaking that for consistency in terms of the patients showing signs of rehabilitation. In other words, if Angelo can pull off acting normal for long enough, the hospital staff might start to feel like there's no reason to keep him in any longer. But what they'll fail to recognize is that the reason he's normal and has been normal is because the hospital and the halfway house have maintained a strict no PCP policy. But I guess what's done is already done. But if you want to weigh in on this aspect, feel free to do so down below. What I am pretty sure we can all agree on is the hope that this jackass is never given the opportunity to hurt another innocent human being ever again. As for Angelo Jr., he was, at the time of the most recently updated article I could find, been recently given a temporary placement with his uncle Jesse Rosas, who we mentioned earlier, and Jesse's wife Tamara. And indeed, their home seemed like a good fit for Angelo Jr. Unlike the elder Angelo, Jesse had a clean record and stated that his own 2 children had always gotten along well with their cousin Angelo Jr. Overall, it seemed like an ideal placement, and even though it's said that Angelo Jr. continued to improve while in his uncle's care, it wasn't too long thereafter that Angelo Jr. was taken in by another aunt named Martha Mendoza. That's pretty much the last thing that was reported that I was able to find about Angelo Jr.'s placement. A family friend asserted that they believed Martha, the aunt, to be a good and healthy placement for the recuperating boy, whereas perhaps not too shockingly, the boy's own mother, Desiree Bermudez, has always continued to refuse all interviews concerning the case. And on that note, I just can't end this without one last quick statement about a slightly different angle of Angelo Jr.'s recovery, one which is nonetheless just as crucial and important as any other. And what I want to say is basically that I've come to notice quite often with cases like these, for a lot of people, the story seems to end with the question of whether the victim was able to make a full or even a partial physical recovery or not. It seems like most of the time that's the part that everyone is waiting with bated breath to discover. Can Angelo Jr. see, or is he left permanently blinded for life? In so many cases like this, it's as if whether Angelo Jr. is okay is hinged on that one aspect, on whether his body is physically recovered or not. It's as if people think that if, say, Angelo Jr. managed to retain at least partial eyesight, that the boy might evidently have a bit of a harder time, but in a sense now we could breathe a sigh of relief thinking that he's doing well, and then we can move on from worrying about it so much. Even the uncle we just mentioned, Jesse, makes a comment about this. As he tells ABC 23, even though he believes little baby Angel has a lot of spirit in him, adding that he's a real adorable kid, he can't help but acknowledge the difficult path that his father has now laid out before him. Jesse remarks that, quote, "It breaks your heart to know a little child who can't defend himself will actually go through something like this. You know, because it's going to stick with them the rest of their life. And no child should go through something like this," end quote. However, the mother herself, when interviewed by a local news outlet, describes the boy as doing well. In fact, here, how about we have a listen to that right now?
Desiree sees her son every Tuesday and Thursday since that incident happened. Amazingly, she says Angelo is doing well.
When I see him, he's real happy, you know, he's the same person, you know. He's a little bit more quiet, you know. When I ask him things, he just, you know, don't really answer right away.
Despite the trauma, Desiree knows it could have been much worse.
If you were paying attention to what we just played, you'll maybe have noticed that Desiree says the boy is doing surprisingly well, only to have that remark followed by one which completely negates that statement, at least in my eyes.
Amazingly, she says Angelo is doing well.
When I see him, he's real happy, you know, he's the same person, you know. He's a little bit more quiet, you know. When I ask him things, he just, you know, don't really answer right away.
That very fact, the boy is now quieter, he's more withdrawn than he was before, he hesitates before he speaks, and so on and so forth. If these things aren't indicative of some psychological changes within him, then I don't know what is. I know this aspect is rather beyond the scope of this video, but I just felt compelled to point it out. It's too often, in my opinion, that with cases of trauma, especially in children, psychological trauma that may have been caused and for which they may also need to seek out help for, is so easily overlooked. It's as if you can't see it, it isn't there, or it isn't that big of a deal. But I think in the end, it's just time that we started paying more attention, because for a victim like Angelo Jr., the case isn't closed when the judge bangs the gavel. Just something to think about. And so that about wraps up this episode of the Odditorium. Thank you sincerely for joining me for this story. I know firsthand that this is not an easy one to digest, but as I see it, a problem rarely goes away by virtue of society simply pretending that it doesn't exist. That said, please do give this video a like if you feel so inclined. You're also more than welcome to subscribe if you haven't already. Last but not least, as always, feel free to share your comments about the story down below. I'm always interested to hear what you have to say. All I only ever ask is that you please be respectful of everyone else's opinions as well. Now with that said, here's wishing everyone a fabulous rest of your day, night, or what have you. As always, I look forward to seeing you back next time. Bye for now.
Late last month, a 4-year-old boy was blinded by his father, telling officers, quote, "Daddy ate my eye." We are live at the scene of where this incident occurred. It's right at that house just beyond those cars.
He's 4 years old. He had bite marks on his hands. I only could see half his face and saw that it was swollen. About within 15 minutes, he had come to, and he kind of looked like a rag doll.
Angelo Mendoza Sr. had fled his home minutes before. The man, who is wheelchair-bound, was spotted no more than a block away mutilating himself with a hatchet.
He was a good dad, you know. I would never think he would do anything to hurt his son, you know.
His son was rushed to the hospital. Doctors told police the boy's left eye and muscle was missing from the child's skull.
He was a good dad, you know.